Welcome back, my friends. Today we are continuing on Dieter Helsnicht. So this is as far as we got the last time round. The rider is more or less complete. Dieter himself, complete with his Chaos Rune Sword over there on the left, and then his Staff of Flaming Death. So I have basically put in, just a basic paint job for his back banner because I am going to be shortly working on the actual banner, and I've got a little something to show you. So as far as I've gotten, I've sketched in his basic design. Just in case you're wondering, it does say Necros in front. Why that is? Well, he is a necromancer, so I suppose he wears his heart on his sleeve. Cool. So today we're going to be primarily concerning ourselves with his Manticore. And this beast, I have got to say, is in huge demand across 4th edition simply because it has the best points to stat line trade off I feel in the game. He's nowhere near as expensive as a dragon. It's clocking in at just 200 points, which is a very affordable figure, yet has some of the most important combat stats. So we're going to be bulking out the flesh area, or just picking out the flesh areas in front of you, as you can see, in Nazdreg yellow, because the version that Dieter Helsnicht rides is notably jaundiced looking. I suppose at some point they made a choice about which colors would best suit an undead mount, and I think they figured that some kind of you know jaundice yellow, slightly unhealthy looking pallor would be most appropriate for someone of this ilk. So blocking in with Nazdreg yellow is the first step, and there is rather a lot to get through. So I hope you'll bear with me as I put this on. But we'll talk a little bit about Manticore stats as we begin. So the Manticore has, I think, the best all-round stats for the kind of monster it is. Let's bear in mind that in 4th edition, you could essentially use any mount you wanted. You could choose just about any mount that you wanted to suit almost any army, so long as it was in your list of rideable creatures. You could essentially have a goblin riding a dragon if you so chose. Never mind whether that's thematically appropriate, whether or not the dragon kind of sees the goblin as just a temporary bring along snack to be consumed at a convenient point. But yeah, somehow this edition of the rules had it that the creatures were essentially bound by magic or by oaths of fealty or some other kind of mechanic into and duped into essentially working with the army. So this sounds like a bad thing at first. It certainly sounds like, thematically it's a little bit flat. There's very little that can explain why what we would consider a noble beast like a dragon, for instance, why they would agree to work alongside dragon goblins. But to be perfectly honest, I think this is a benefit more than anything else, simply because it brings out, that desire to build really weird and wonderful hobby projects. So, say for example, if you wanted to create an undead army that resides on the edge of some like spider infested wood, you could actually have your necromancers all ride gigantic spiders, and that would be perfectly okay, as in that would be usable within the rules. And I mean, yes, I know to a certain extent anything is allowed within the rules, right? Like you don't need the kind of divine sanction of Games Workshop for you to field whatever it is that you chose to field. You could just do it anyway. But sometimes it's nice to have just the idea that you could bring along this army to any meet or any event or any tournament, or even play with someone that you've never played before, and not have to sit down and go through all the nuances of how you've modified the core rules in order to get started playing. So I get it. um, I know there's nothing keeping you from doing whatever you choose, but at the same time, just the fact that the rules were accommodating enough to essentially allow you to do such a thing uh, is kind of great, right? Because I like the idea that you have a little bit of latitude in deciding what kind of creatures you chose. There are evil dragons, there are good, noble, and sort of upright kind of dragons, And I think the Warhammer world is big enough to accommodate either of those. Plus, it really reinforces the idea that monsters are kind of a force of they're kind of a neutral force. I mean, they're always going to be more appropriate creatures to accompany certain factions, but really, what is it about a Manticore that makes it a chaos creature or a dark elf creature necessarily? What makes it less mutated than, say, a Griffin, which is acknowledged to be a chaos creature, a creature of chaos, right? It's a creature that's basically straight to close to the northern poles, and essentially had a bit of a chaos-inspired facelift, kind of against its will. So does that make it less of a noble beast with possessed of an indomitable spirit to serve its master or fulfill its own ends? Well, I think a lot of that really depends on how you feel about it. And I think this system of allowing characters in Warhammer to ride whichever beast they so chose really brings out a little something special when it came to fourth edition. It's never been done again since, because shortly after this, when we get to the later editions of Warhammer Fantasy, well, I can't say shortly after, but not well, essentially moving along from this point, we get to the point where essentially you have just codified creatures to accompany every single faction, and the ability to field a random beast from your menagerie, so to speak, is lost in a sense. So that's kind of unfortunate because I believe a lot of armies lost a lot of color and a lot of options as a result. Um, but the flip side of that, I suppose, is the idea that some of the creatures just flat out provide, beyond whatever theming or whatever concept or idea you have to represent your faction. I guess just the idea that some of the creatures give a better trade off for points will always attract a certain kind of player. And Manticores, in that regard, were just really, really popular as a result because Manticores at 200 points clock in with the most important stats. They've got a strength and toughness of 7, putting them very close to what a dragon can put out in terms of offensive strength and defensive power. They may not have a scaly skin armor save, but they do, however, at least have a decent number of wounds. So they've got 5 wounds, which is not low, but also not high. Just good enough to more or less be likely to survive a single game, and that's kind of good enough, I suppose. Plus, it's got a decent 4 attacks, which in many cases would kind of double what your average melee character in a non-chaos army, I suppose, could put out. So it's a very good place. It's a very good enough kind of stat profile. It does good work against most opponents, and frankly, that's hardly a bad thing, right? It's got good strength, good defense, good number of attacks, good number of wounds. It's frankly rather good all around, and there's very little to kind of serve in the way of a downside to fielding a Manticore at this point. Later on, Manticores evolve to get, they become a lot more uncontrollable, and there is the real idea that they might break or basically behave against their owner's wishes. But frankly, I think that's a little bit of the Chaos Army or bad guy design that was creeping into Games Workshop at this point, coming in because Chaos guys, undead guys, bad guys, we can't have nice things. Essentially, the spirits of wanting bad guys to be self-sabotaging, which is conceptually interesting. I'm not opposed to the idea, nor am I, the kind of person who immediately looks at it and goes, "Well, that's just making it like a Saturday morning cartoon." Not necessarily the case, because I think thematically it's an interesting concept, but it also made, rather than just adding color to the unit, it made them significantly harder to use. So Manticores struggled to be controlled, and they had a tendency to kind of go ape should the rider be killed, or else if the rider fails a leadership check to try to keep the bound monster in check. There was a tendency that Manticores will go a little bit funny. That, alongside the fact that the Manticore stats never really improved or never really brought anything to the table to justify the nerf, was a very unfortunate state of affairs indeed for this noble beast. Because as much as it's a strange looking beast, I really like it conceptually. I think the Manticore is just such an iconic creature. It's just the weirdest thing with its funny mandrill kind of weird pseudo human kind of face, and it's got just so much character and personality going on for it. So anyway, I'm going to drop in a little bit of Nazdreg yellow into these little crevices along its tail. Yeah, so creature of chaos, right? So these guys have scorpion tails, and I believe at this point in the rules there wasn't really anything to take the poison into account, although I might be wrong. I don't remember seeing anything, but if you've got a copy of the book handy, I think there might be something to the fact that he's got a scorpion tail and technically should be producing venom and venom attacks. It's either that or it's been worked into his stat line as part of the strength that he has, which, to be fair, is a little bit exceptional. I think most of the large creatures do not have a strength of 7, nor do they necessarily have a toughness of 7. The lack of an armor save of any kind is a slight problem, because there are plenty of weapons that just simply bypass toughness. So, for example, were you to be hit by poisoned attacks, that might be a bit of an issue later on. But at this stage, toughness of 7 is pretty darn good. Cool. So we're gonna jump in and add red, which is the other bizarre color that was used on this particular model, and it's one of the most iconic things about this figure, I suppose. Just the fact that it's got such a weirdly vibrant color scheme. Um, the other possibility is, I suppose, the model was painted with the intent to try to distinguish it as far as possible from the other large creature that was released with this army, and that would be the zombie dragon. The zombie dragon was a really lurid shade of green, which kind of earned it the epithet of flying cabbage. Which, in that sense, to be fair to people, it kind of really did look a little bit cabbagey. But let's not do that poor beast a disservice anymore. That's just another one of the models which I'm hoping to get onto my to-do list at some point, but so far it's proving a little challenging to track down because it is in fact a very rare model. I do have a friend who is, I've been told, willing to trade it with me for something, but I'll have to try to figure that out first before I make any real promises about painting it on this channel. In the meantime, we will content ourselves with Dieter's mount, which I believe has such a unique look. Very interesting indeed. A little bit odd, if I'm to be honest, but I don't mind it at all. So lots of red going on. The reason why I've chosen to keep Dieter off his mount is because, well, originally I was planning to have the mount interchangeable, but to be perfectly honest, Dieter is such a tight fit for this mount, because this is an absolutely tiny Manticore. All things considered, this is a 60mm base, a round base, because I like the look of the round bases, not because I have any intention to play any other game. But I just happen to really like the look of these round bases, plus, just the ability to pivot and look great from every angle is a good thing for me. So this Manticore is very, very small indeed. In the back in the day, it would be mounted on a 40mm base, which, as you know, is tiny. A 40mm base is basically, in this round version at least, is what you would put a Terminator on. And this guy is, yes, he's bigger than the Terminator, but to be honest, yeah, he's still a fairly small mount. Despite the fact that Dieter himself is actually quite tall and statuesque. Something to do with how he has to have a very, very wide cowboy bow-legged stance in order to fit his mount, I suppose. But there you go, there you have it. Still a fascinating model, and definitely a very unique color scheme, especially for something that's designed to go into the undead army list at the time of release. The other thing I'm thinking about is there's actually no other Manticore of a similar time period, actually. So perhaps this is the only Manticore you could get at the time, which is a little unfortunate because this Manticore, which clearly bears the hallmarks of being sculpted by Trish Carden, then Trish Morrison. Um, I don't think it fits many models because it's kind of specific to Dieter Helsnicht, unfortunately. So if you had picked up this model with the idea that you would swap riders with some other model, so that you could have, I don't know, a Night Goblin riding a Manticore for some bizarre reason, um, yeah, this model might have struggled to fit your rider of choice. But you know what? That's not a rare problem during this edition. And people who really were invested in their themes spent lots of time trying to figure out how exactly to solve these problems anyway, and the ones that persevered surely found a way. Because a Manticore's power is not to be sniffed at for 200 points. So, much more red to go. Unfortunately, I need to grab a little bit more red. Sorry about that. A couple more drops of this stuff, and we are ready to continue. So this is our usual red mix because it's got a nice sort of brownish tinge to it, brownish orange tinge. This is Blood Angels red mixed with Gryph Hound orange to give that really sort of warm color, which I think works as a more naturalistic tone. I think maybe a more vibrant fire engine red might come across as a little bit strange on what is essentially supposed to be a wild beast. But yeah, I mean, I guess once you consider that this is essentially an auburn haired manticore, maybe we ought not to be thinking so hard about it. So I'm going to be putting on more of this on all of the furred areas on his body, and to be fair, a great deal of this miniature is covered in furs. I think part of the problem with the reception of this miniature initially was because people expected it to look a lot more like a lion, when in fact it kind of looks a lot more like a mandrill. And all things considered, mandrills are absolutely terrifying. So that might have affected the reception of this miniature. That plus, well, I mean, it was around for a fairly long time, and it was a bit of a popular unit because it was the main centerpiece in the undead army at a time when the undead army was really very diverse and kind of offered a unique proposition to anybody wanting to collect the undead, which is that contrary to most other races, which were kind of all of one species, like the Skaven, for example, or dwarves, generally speaking, you'd have Skaven and dwarves and very little else. Uh, the undead army was, yes, most of them are probably human or were human at some stage. But the cool part is that they all had very slightly different rules, and the whole army played a little bit like the bestiary section of a role playing game. So wraiths had very different rules, for example, very little similarity with the way whites operated. And likewise, ghouls and zombies and skeletons all had very slightly different rules and offered you a wealth of choices based on the way you chose to engage with the game at the point. To a certain extent, if you were a fan of Blood Bowl, the Blood Bowl Undead Army, which is Undead Team, sorry, which was also sculpted by Gary Morley, by the way, also offered that sort of choice between skeletons and zombies, and really you could build your team many different ways, and that kind of was a big selling point of playing the undead, just the sheer diversity and choice that you could bring to bear within the army, even if, to be perfectly honest, not every choice really worked all as well as it might otherwise have. um, Anyway, so that of course applies to the monsters as well, which is why Manticore was very popular. And in fact, I have friends who had armies that included multiple Manticores because 200 points is a steal. You could get quite a lot of mileage out of 200 points out of your character allocation, and it would not break the bank. Plus, you would utterly dominate like Pegasus or Great Eagles, which were the other common flying mounts of the day with a Manticore. Not only were you essentially causing terror, but you also had a very, very impressive stat line. and lots of attacks, and a very decent weapon skill as well. Unless I'm mistaken, this guy had weapon skill 6 and strength 7, toughness 7. So yeah, a very, very impressive beast indeed. Lots of wounds, lots of attacks. Very, very nice. And for just 200 points. Cool. I am realizing that the vast majority of this model is red. There is so much red on this dude. So yeah, sorry, please bear with me as I search endlessly for more red on this miniature to cover in my red mix. In fact, I'm going to be shortly reaching for more paint to put on my wet palette because holy crap, there's a lot of red on this guy. The wings themselves are mostly black, and that again goes back to my theory that either somebody figured that an undead miniature had to have quite a distinct amount of black on it to look like an undead model, or else, unfortunately, your heavy metal painter or your whoever was painting these for the box art might have run out of time, which is a more common occurrence than you might think, because Games Workshop in this day, at the point of release of this miniature back in the 80s, was a lot more amateurish than it is now, and that sort of thing would occasionally happen, which is why, like I mentioned in an earlier video, a lot of miniatures sometimes had a lot more black showing than they would originally, warrant. Because to be perfectly honest, a lot of these models were undercoated in black, in just a black spray, chaos black spray specifically. So yeah, a bit more black on the fetlocks. That's the furry bits around the claws. Well, fetlocks has usually more to do with horses, but you get what I mean. He's got furry ankles. That's not a bad thing. Let's make sure that we do every leg and not miss any of these, as is very easy to do. I find that when it comes to painting any creature that has, well, kind of like this, right, like multiple limbs, is that you kind of mentally check off as many of these limbs as you have as you work on them in your mind, so that you don't miss any of these key parts later on. And as far as you can, try to get the bulk of the miniature done in one pass, at least as far as base coats go, because it's really hard to kind of come back to a miniature like this if you have a very non-systematic way of approaching it, because it's kind of big and daunting, and it's very easy to kind of lose track of where you were in the process. So, to the best of my ability, I'll try to finish this to a decent standard in one sitting, and with the full knowledge that we'll probably need to come in to do additional touch-ups later on. But because I intend to do more than a few videos on this miniature, we will be revisiting it quite regularly. Already I've had the opportunity to revisit the back banner on Dieter himself. I've added a few sneaky highlights on the back. No need to show you that really, because it's not particularly exciting or unique. But really, it just gives a little bit more brightness in what was essentially a very dark part of the miniature, right at his back. Cool. So, I have realized that I missed a little bit of flesh on that one leg here. So let me just fix that very briefly. Not the hardest thing in the world to reach this model, thankfully. Despite the fact that it's got 4 legs, this miniature has quite an obliging pose. Nice and easy to reach all the details. So the other thing I need to fix is that he's got this row. It's almost like a toothbrush. This whole section of fur underneath his tail, and that goes all the way down to his nether regions, which I will mercifully paint red as well, so that we no longer need to think about it until maybe later in the painting process when we look at highlights. But I actually do like the way this red is turning out, and kudos to whoever came up with this color scheme, because with just one coat of contrast paint, granted that contrast paint wasn't invented at the time, we've actually come to quite a good place. And this guy's girl, whatever the case may be, is starting to look quite menacing. Great. I think the Manticore looks quite groovy. Yeah, so I will come back in to add additional shading to define some of these areas a little bit further and to sort of minimize the need for highlights, because I don't really intend to do too much in the way of highlights on this miniature. I think keeping it sort of nice and even across with a quality base coat applied neatly will be the bulk of our work on this miniature. Yeah. Okay, cool. So let's jump right in. I've got a bit of skeleton horde, and I need to pick out his teeth because those are some massive choppers. And ideally, I would like to leave the tongue white, but I think I've missed that ship has sailed, I'm afraid. So that's okay, not too big of a deal. Just apply a coat of skeleton horde all over his teeth. I'm going to keep referring to him as a he, okay? Because I'm not too bothered by the concept of gendering a fictional creature. Let's just leave it as a she, as a he rather. There we go, stumbling already. Cool. That's the teeth. All good. Just to make sure that there's enough coverage, enough of that sort of darker line around the margins. That's really half of what we're gunning for with a contrast coat like that anyway. Looking good. Missed the spot. Let's just fix that quickly. Sometimes if you see that you miss a spot, it's best to sort of jump in immediately and nip it in the bud, because there's every chance that you might not catch sight of it again, which maybe tells you a little bit about how vital it is to fix that thing. Maybe it's not that vital if you're never going to catch sight of it again. But to be perfectly honest, I'd rather catch it now than later. So yeah. Cool. Black Templar. Great color. When you apply it like this over a large surface, you can really sort of see that it kind of almost like chromatographies a way to reveal that there is quite a bit of blue in the recesses. Blue or green, depending on how your eyes feel about this. This might just be a white dress, blue dress situation. So your mileage may vary a little bit, but suffice to say, there are colors going on with this paint that go beyond just neutral black, and that is to our benefit, frankly, for a model like this, because it gives us a little bit more of an interesting tone to undercut such a large area of the miniature, and gives us a little bit of interest to draw our eyes to. So that looks all right, nice and simple. I have diluted this ever so slightly with a touch of water that was on my brush, kind of subconsciously. I don't think I was deliberately doing it, but I think that's again working to our benefit, because now it's letting a little bit more of that color show through, whether blue or green, depending on how you look at it. The point is that it really allows us to see a bit more of the detail on this section of the wing. And these wings are quite interesting because these were the earlier set of wings. So these ones predate the big standard plastic wings that basically came on all subsequent Wyvern models, for example, or Dragon models. Those were quite often referred to as Dragon wings, and they would be a major part of almost every kit um, after they were first used. So as much as we like to think that Games Workshop is a design company first and foremost, I think some of their most important work is in the user design for assembling these as kits. So in the beginning, Games Workshop appears to have been very focused on trying to just create good miniatures, But at some point, they made the very, very important decision, much more important than I think we would typically give them credit for, of basically putting together a base that would work with metal tabs. This was, in essence, the what we would call the slaughter base. And the idea of a slaughter base is key because it allows miniature armies to be kept affordable, in miniatures of roughly the same era, and indeed in a lot of like Ral Partha miniatures, for example, or many of these contemporaries for a lot of these Games Workshop kits. The bases would notably be made out of um, whatever material it was that the rest of the miniature was. So typically tin or lead or pewter, as the case may be. And what we find with that is that they inevitably get a lot of additional weight from the base, or else they are, a lot more expensive because that's just a lot more lead or pewter or whatever metal it was that they were cast in. And frankly, there was a sort of inconsistency in the look of the bases. Plastic bases is the real one of the real reasons why Games Workshop pulled away from their competition, because this combination of plastic parts, which frankly Games Workshop had the volume to manufacture in huge quantities to save cost, and yet they were charging full price, comparable price to miniatures that were based in metal, right? Really gave them that little bit of a margin edge that allows them to pull ahead of their competition. And what this means is that, so when it came to things like with the success of slaughter bases, I think Games Workshop was always looking for ways to kind of chip away at the margin, so to speak. You have to remember that at this point, a lot of miniatures were just a few pence, right, to maybe a pound or two each back in the 80s. And what they did was, by using plastic components paired with metal pieces, so metal bodies and maybe plastic wings, plastic bases, and in the case of, say, the Rogue Trader Orc Knobs, uh, or Orc Boys, essentially, they came with plastic guns, plastic arms, and this really sort of helped the bottom line for Games Workshop. So this tiny bit of saving per miniature, and bear in mind that Games Workshop was pursuing what I would call a more volume sales approach at the time. They really got pretty good sales figures and pretty good margins out of their miniatures. Certainly better than, say, their contemporaries like Ral Partha, for example, who were still providing metal bases, which were both heavier and costlier to sell. So that became a big deal. And the reason why I bring this up is because that's why we have the same plastic wings being used for many generations of big dragon-like beastie, like the Orc War Boss, for example. It began with the Orc Shaman on Wyvern. The Shaman on Wyvern had metal wings, these exact wings, actually, to be honest. And then after that, it switched to the plastic wings when it came to the first Ashak the Slaughterer mini. And then after that, it changed to um, yeah, and when the model basically changed to the generic Warlord on Wyvern model. Wyvern. I keep saying Weevil, so yeah, Wyvern. So the generic Warlord on Wyvern, it had essentially the same universal mounts that would allow it to use the plastic wings as well, and that really helped the look of the miniature, as well as just the consistency, and just generally speaking, to keep the weight of the miniatures themselves to a reasonable level. So yeah, that was kind of significant. So yeah, while design is a big deal, Games Workshop is masterful in their manipulation of the industry at this point. Supply and demand, and one way is to make sure that they were selling enough volume that they could replace a large number of their components in plastic to bring down that cost. And so it was that when the cost of metal skyrocketed, they were well placed to survive because a lot of their key components were already made in plastic. And therefore, the move towards plastic, which was a good thing because it seemed people really enjoyed plastic. Like over the years, people would increasingly prefer plastic. I have to say that in the beginning, there was a lot of resistance against the plastic movement, the movement towards plastic miniature components and later whole miniatures. A lot of people were quite resistant because I think model soldiers were always led. There was this whole group of people, as I recall, mostly veterans who were convinced that the metal models felt weightier, felt better in the hand, and felt more valuable, whereas the plastic felt like cheap tat, which I think is a point of view that's no longer with us, with how easy to work with plastic became, and as the quality of detail and just the level of finish and engineering improved, I think people took to plastic quite a bit, especially when when metal models were eventually replaced with fine cast. That was a fun moment in time, wasn't it? When Games Workshop thought that instead of producing metal miniatures, they would sell resin prints, resin casts rather, not prints. And the sheer lack of quality control, because they rushed the process of switching from metal to resin, really put a sour taste in everyone's mouth. But ironically, increased the perception of Games Workshop plastics. Because as we all saw, the plastic models were fine. It was only the old metals that were kind of not good. So that kind of hastened the move away from just that kind of production, and ironically helped Games Workshop's transition towards this more computer assisted design approach to making miniatures in plastic, which was a far cry from essentially sculpting things 1:1 in putty, so that they could then be spun cast by a dedicated mold maker and metal casting or later resin casting person. So that kind of sped up the move away from cottage industriness and sort of accelerated the move towards mass production and plastic styrene injection molding being the main method of production. Yeah. Anyway, history lesson over, or rant over, as the case may be, depending on how much you love metal models. I have to be honest with you, I hate metal models. I am that generation of heretic that admires the sort of aesthetic of the metal models, but I hate the working with the actual material. At one point, I stopped painting miniatures entirely, and that was because a lot of my metal collection started to get very worn down after many years of gameplay. You might say, well, by that point, you've had so much time with them, you've played so many games, you've had so much mileage out of your figures, maybe it's okay if they don't last forever. But as far as I'm concerned, I was in the market for something that would last forever, to be perfectly honest with you. And I would like them to be something that I would have around for a long time, because I did spend, first of all, a premium amount of money to acquire these tiny little miniatures. And also, more importantly, I put a shocking amount of my time and effort into getting them just the way I want them. It would be great if they would last forever. Thank you very much. Or at least last my lifetime, because I expect to be buried with my collection of miniatures. So there. Yes. Anyway, so we're moving on to apply Last of the Black on the tail, being careful to not cover up the little jointed sections between each of these armor plates. I really always did like the way this looked on the miniature. I thought that just the fact that you could see the little joints in between added quite a bit of reality to this miniature when I was growing up. So I really liked it. Unfortunately, by the time I kind of had the resources to actually buy one of these, um, much time had passed, and frankly, this model looked a little bit undersized and kind of unimpressive. Still cute, but cute wasn't what I was going for at the time because I was in my edgy teens and I wanted something that looked impressive and scary and not something that was, beautifully sculpted, if a little kind of adorable. I have since changed my tune and I'm perfectly happy to paint anything that has a modicum of design logic behind it because these are kind of like little treasures, right? I really like the way they look and I really enjoy the process of putting paint on them and collecting them. And the tracking down on them on eBay and other sources, not so much. But such is the life. Cool. So, looking decent. I have noticed that in the original Manticore figure, the spiky tail bit is not black, but I kind of like the way it looks in black because it kind of makes it look a lot more like part of that rear half of the creature, that scorpion-y bit. So I'm going to do it in black, but I might reserve the right to have a different colored highlight, maybe. Let's see how that goes as we progress. With large models like this, sometimes you kind of really just need to not map out your progression so much. You don't need to exhaustively plan every detail because if you do, you might never get started. But sort of give yourself the leeway and the flexibility to maybe consider how you might want to adapt to the way the model is turning out over time. And that hopefully makes the whole process a little bit more pleasurable and a little bit less, like performance anxiety, the miniature. Cool. So we are going to. Do I need to hair dry it? Might be a good idea actually. I'm just checking around the model for bits which aren't quite finished. I'm gonna add a bit more Nazdreg yellow around the eyes. And a bit more around the shadowed parts of the body, basically where the limbs join with muscle groups between the major muscle groups. And around the margins of the deepest crevices and folds. I'm using a larger brush for this stage. This is, you can't really see it at all, but it's an Ashley size 2 Taclon. And this is a good size because it holds a very large amount of contrast paint indeed, which is why I managed to get the wings done as quickly as I did and to sensible standard. Okay, so missed the spot. Did you see it? Ah, just there. I think it might be time to add Dieter to the mix because I do like, as much as I like the idea of painting him in parts, I do find that working with the model more or less fully assembled lets me better see where highlights are required rather than just applying highlights wherever they might occur. Which is one of the ways that I kind of maintain the focus of what I want the viewer to look at. So I'm going to hit this with a hairdryer and I'm going to assemble him with Dieter on. As I mentioned earlier, I don't think I will be keeping the rider separate. I think I'll probably just glue it on because it doesn't fit any other model anyway. Yeah, back in a bit. Okay, as you can see, Dieter is now sitting proudly astride his Manticore. And we're going to come in with a bit of purple to pick out his teeth and tongue. So this is a mix of Magos purple 1:1 with Luxion purple, which gives a slightly more saturated kind of purple without being a little bit too dark, in my opinion, like Luxion purple would be if used neat. So I am applying this onto the mouth areas of the Manticore, the interior of the mouth, as well as along the gum line, which I have cleaned up with a little bit of Vallejo Silver Grey. So that goes over the edge, and as you can see, that adds a little bit of life into that model. And then the inside of the mouth. So I'm still mulling over the idea of gluing Dieter Helsnicht on, because I don't know. I like the idea that if Dieter were to be taken out as a casualty, I can at least remove him. It doesn't really matter that I'm almost. It's going to be a rare thing for me to be playing like 4th edition, or 5th edition, as the case may be. But I still want to keep the option open. Yeah. So putting the purple over the eye area. So right now he's held in place with a little bit of essentially blue tack. And that basically keeps him in position. You can sort of see a little bit of blue tack in the rear under his saddle. But I might very well glue him on at some stage, because I'm sure the wobbling will drive me crazy at some stage. Cool. So let's grab some Vallejo Silver Grey, and let's start to add highlights to his teeth. So for these teeth, I like to put vertical striations. And generally speaking, I like to put either 2 or 3. If it's 3, then there'll be one central line and then one on either end. Other than that, for the ones which are a little bit smaller, I just either highlight it towards the base, like so, or else like this bottom tooth, I just highlight it with a V. So once more, 1 line, 2 lines, and the 3rd line. For the smaller teeth, more of just either a single highlight or a kind of a V shape on this lower tooth. So there and there. There we go. So this is just to suggest that there is a little bit of a root to these teeth visible, and it's a good way of adding a little bit of extra, painting on a little extra detail onto these teeth, especially when they're so large and significant like this Manticore's teeth are. There we go. So next, I'm going to grab a bit of white, and we're going to shadow my previous lines and just apply one more stage of highlighting to the teeth, just to make sure that they're really nice and bright. So this time we're focusing more on the center of each tooth towards the point, and that sort of makes them look sharp and dangerous. In theory, just a little bit of emphasis on that point. And I do believe these are looking fairly decent and pointy, because it turns out being undead gives you a really good dental plan. Great. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the grey parts of the miniature. Well, the black parts of the miniature, which are his claws. And we're going to be applying some basic highlights to give them a little bit of direction. So there is a sort of sharp ridge along each of these. I don't want to put too much grey on them, so I'm just going to paint a single grey line. This is just black Templar plus a bit more of the silver grey, the Vallejo Silver Grey, which gives me a softer highlight than if I were to add straight white, in my opinion. Probably I'm just more used to regulating the amount that makes it onto the surface. Right, so we go on to the back leg. You could, in theory, paint multiple lines of highlight on these claws, but I find that there is a point where you simply have way too much gray going on, and then it starts to look a little washed out. So the next stage is just a little bit more silver gray, and this time the idea is to apply it at the apex point of the claw, like so. So there is a bit of a direction towards what should be the thickest part of the claw. I'll fix that in a bit, like so. So it kind of makes it look a little bit more, a little like a little gemstone, almost like a specular highlight, the way you would use to finish off a gemstone. You know that little white dot that you place in the lower or in the upper right hand corner of a gemstone? This does much the same thing, making your claw essentially look hard and dangerous. Okay, let me just fix that little boo-boo. Okay. Actually not that obvious. Great. Okay, so let's jump in and add some highlights for the flesh, because there is a lot of this going on, and the sooner we get started on this, the sooner it starts to look more smooth and complete. So I am taking dark flesh, mixing in a little bit of our Nazdreg yellow, and we're just going to clean up some of these areas. Now, when you apply contrast paint, it tends to pull away from the raised areas anyway, right? So you might struggle to basically find the amounts of lightening color to add in order that it immediately functions as a highlight. And you'll find that you probably need to mix a lighter highlight than you expect to initially, at least. At least that's the case I found, especially on this model, where the Nazdreg yellow I cut with a bit of contrast medium in order for it to flow a little bit away from the raised areas, giving me slightly more of a so-called highlight, or proto-highlight, or pre-highlight, depending on what terminology you want to use. So in other words, you are going to need to mix in a little bit more dark sand than you necessarily anticipate when you apply your first highlight. But it should turn out just fine. Cheekbone. I suppose you could paint this pure mandrill and give him like blue parts on his face, but I think it's okay. I think we'll go with this weird sort of lion hybrid monstrosity, because I don't actually believe that Trish Morrison at the time, was essentially sculpting a baboon or a mandrill. I think basically this was a weird sort of liony creature, but the line between lion and mandrill, I suppose, can be a bit hard to define. I don't believe there was any other liony creature in the range at the time. Despite this, I think she did a really good job. I don't know, I have a lot of love towards this model. And I suppose your mileage could vary. But these days at least, the sight of these models are so quaint and inspire so much love that, yeah, really happy to just see them painted and added to my collection. Doesn't matter if they look slightly derpy, or in the case of this guy, very derpy. Still think he looks great. So much fun to paint. Further to what I was saying about making sure that you mix enough of a highlight and mix enough of your lightening color into the highlight, I believe I'm using almost pure dark sand at this point. I almost said Dark Souls. I don't know, man. Remember that if you overdo your highlight, you can come back in and apply a bit of the contrast paint to blend in the highlights, which I'm sure I will do at some point. But I think the idea is to just make sure that you get the textures that you want onto the surface of the miniature and get it looking its best. So the thing that's making me slightly unsettled is just how much black there is on the wings. I'm following the official color scheme, which might prove to be a bit of a challenge because I can see myself wanting to apply a lot more colors to the wings. But I'm going to trust in the process for now. And maybe at some point, if I decide to change the colors of the wings, I'll do a separate video for that because this model really deserves it. It's such a special thing. Though weird though it may be. So pure dark sand for the striations on its face and the very tips of the cheeks, which really overhang by quite a great amount. So as the stretched lips and these folds on its face. Quirky looking beast. So veins. So little highlights. So reaching in to get these little points of light just right. I guess where I have a problem with this miniature color scheme, I suppose, just a little, is in the idea that the skin parts of the wings, the sort of arm parts of the wings, right? Because it does have bat-like wings, therefore it's got the wing as a stretched out membrane between the finger bones, the tarsals, and metatarsals. I kind of find it strange that those limbs aren't the same color as the Manticore's flesh, which is this Nazdreg yellow blend. But at the same time, I have seen plenty of bats where the fur on its face is a different color to the skin of its forelimbs. So maybe that's how it is here. I certainly don't want to add too much lightness to the wings because that takes away from its sort of bat-like looking quality. So I might just leave it as is. It's okay. We'll puzzle it out as we go along. This channel, if nothing, is just me puzzling up, color choices and ideas as I go about painting my miniatures. And if you've watched enough of these, you would know that. So yeah. Feel free to let me know in the comments below if you felt that it's a better idea for me to have used a different color for the wings, or if you kind of like the way the black wings are looking, you can let me know as well. The wings are definitely classic. It's in the old style for sure, and I kind of like the way that looks. Cool. So I am going to get some Gore Grunta fur to help shade down the red parts of the model. This will provide some intense shading in order to give the hair a little bit more volume and give it that freshly out of the hairdresser's look. So this is going to go into recesses like here, as you can see. Lots of shading, lots of intensity in the recesses to kind of break up some of these clumps of hair, because there is a lot of hair going on and it's all kind of spaghetti like and chaotic and unsorted. If we skip this step, this helps to impose a certain amount of order and readability onto the surface. Plus, by darkening where the hair meets the face, we can make the face look deeper set and more imposing. Also, it's a good way to sort of sell the volumes of the hair, which are actually sculpted into the surface of the model. It's just that the contrast paint enough in itself is not quite enough to define it. So Gore Grunta fur is really the ideal color to sort of add a naturalistic look. Conceptually, it's, I mean, just as a color, not conceptually, it's kind of in between the red blend that we use, which is Blood Angels red and Gryph Hound orange, and the Nazdreg yellow, because it's a sort of reddish mahogany brown, and that really helps us to pull these two colors closer together by using a color that's kind of appears to be somewhere in between those two color ranges. So yeah, there we go. Just putting a bit of a highlight over here and I missed earlier. Cool. So what other models do you have that, what was the model that you sort of missed out on picking up when you were younger? What was your bucket list model that you always wanted to have but never quite had the chance to pick up? Okay, let me know in the comments below. I'm really, really curious which models kind of get your nostalgia juices flowing. Um, as you can see, I have a lot of models that do that for me. And sometimes we get lucky and we get to pick up the models that we always wanted to paint and hopefully do them justice on camera. Which, to be fair, sometimes can be a tall order. So I am grabbing a little bit more Black Templar, or I'm trying to, in order to mix highlight colors for the wings. So let's see how that goes. I suspect this layer of highlights will go a long way to helping me decide whether I like the way the black looks or not. So I am focusing primarily on the wing bones, painting the long tarsals. It's crazy when you think about it that these are essentially the finger bones of a bat. Oops. Let me just fix that very quickly. Pardon me. Cool, let's go back to doing the grey. So I unfortunately got a bit of black on the base. Cool, so let's go with the highlights. So just the long bones. You use your finger to kind of smooth it off if needed. These highlights don't need to be extremely intense. In fact, it's best to keep them a little more subtle and focus on the leading edge of the wings, like so. When it comes to the joints, I generally just put 2 bumps because I think that better imitates the look of a knuckle, which is essentially what these are. And I'm finding that as I apply this, I'm beginning to like the black after all. After all that whinging and whining. I'm beginning to think this looks pretty decent. I certainly like the black skin on the arm, the forearm-like joints. It certainly has more of the look of a bat. Maybe that's no bad thing, considering that manticores are supposed to have the wings of a bat, at least in folklore. Okay, so just a little bit more attention onto the tail, ignoring the fact that the model is oddly wobbly because it's just held on using blue tack. Little pointy tip. And you find that when you apply paint on the model with full strength paint versus diluted paint, you get 2 different colors on the surface. And that can save you mixing one highlight instead of making sure that you slavishly mix every highlight and apply it. You can just apply paint on the surface with different levels of intensity by controlling the amount of paint in the brush, thus giving you 2 different shades. Well, 2 applications of the same shades but with different intensity, and that can save you time when highlighting. I'd say that we can keep the black fairly subtle. Because we don't want to turn it grey. But yeah, we are coming to a good place as far as this model is looking so far. As usual, there's a lot of highlights that you can continue to add, but I think it's looking pretty decent. If he were to sit straight, please. And then we just want to add eyes into those little recesses. It's one eye. It's another. A little bit of black to trim it down. And I think we're good. Okay. Alright guys, I think we've reached a happy point with this miniature on camera. I hope you've enjoyed watching me paint him. And then next up, it's time to do the banner, which we will do separately most likely. Thanks for watching. Likes, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. If you enjoyed watching me paint Dieter up until this point, more